This tale does not begin in the ancient groves of Morn, nor the soaring crags of Eryri, nor the deep valleys of Arhondda. It begins on the French coast, at Calais, when that ancient port was still occupied by England. In 1530, the city and surrounding lands had been part of England for 2 centuries, but it was the last foothold in a once expansive territory within France. Henry VIII had been king for 2 decades and was trying to get rid of his first wife, butting heads with Rome over his attempt to annul the marriage and carrying on with ladies-in-waiting. In the same year, a Welshman by the name of Ellie Griffith arrived at the harbour of Calais and entered the walled city through the Lantern Gate. He had taken work as a soldier in the English army garrisoned there. Like many of his fellow countryfolk, Griffith had made the best of a world where the Welsh were a conquered people. During the following decade of the 1530s, Henry VIII would seek to consolidate English dominance over Wales and further impress upon the Welsh nobility that their future was in fashionable London, not the backwards culture of their homeland. England had conquered Wales in 1282, and the following centuries of struggle and revolt had only resulted in harsher English measures and ultimately apartheid for the Welsh. By the turn of the 1500s, the bad old days of the independence struggle were long over, and men like Ellie Griffith had got the message that speaking English, not Welsh, was how one got on in the world. Yet Griffith was a man of 2 worlds. To all appearances, he abided by the realpolitik of English cultural hegemony, even glorying in the battles fought and won by his fellow English soldiers. But his writing reveals an internal world that revolved around the great myths and legends of his native Wales. Before arriving at Calais, he had been in service to a nobleman in London, a role that gave him enough leisure time to pursue his interests with relish. It was in London that his love of Welsh literature flourished into a copious collection of texts copied into a large tome with a quick and tidy hand. Writing in his mother tongue in these texts, Griffith shows himself to be an erudite and objective thinker, broad and ranging in his interests, yet firmly rooted in the soil of his native culture. By the time he arrived at Calais, he was ready to embark on a much greater work of his own devising. By 1532, Henry VIII was making eyes at the French king Francis I. The 2 regents met at Calais that year, Henry seeking support for the annulment of his marriage, and Francis seeing if he could turn the English king's dislike of Rome to his own ends. By the same year, Ellie Griffith had clearly found his feet at Calais garrison. While the kings and their courts bathed in their opulence, Griffith was working on the first parts of what would become, over the following decades, one of the most detailed accounts of world history ever written in the Welsh language. His great masterpiece, Chronicle o Wech Oesoedd y Byd, the Chronicle of the 6 Ages of the World. Although following a contemporary style in historical writing, drawing on English scholars in particular, his work was naturally imbued with a rather Welsh perspective. As a result, Griffith's Chronicle not only covers the major events in world history as commonly understood at this period, but also many episodes and accounts from the rich culture of Wales. Amongst the myriad stories and legends Griffith recorded, we find the earliest complete version of Taliesin, the Tale of Taliesin. At the time, it was one of the most popular folk tales amongst the Cymry and had been told up and down the country for countless generations. Snippets of the tale can be found in the poetry of earlier centuries, and not just in the rustic verses of the common folk, but in the classical poetry composed at the highest levels of Welsh society. The Taliesin myth seemed to have permeated the whole of Welsh culture, both high and low, and it was the most natural thing in the world for Griffith to include it in his Welsh history of everything. What follows is a translation from Ellie Griffith's Chronicle, slightly adapted for the modern listener. The Tale of Taliesin. When King Arthur was just beginning his career, sometime towards the end of the 5th century, there was a nobleman living in the land called Penllyn. He was called Tegid Foel, and according to the story, his inherited home was the body of water we call Llyn Tegid, Tegid Lake. He had a wife called Ceridwen, whom the writing says was skilled and learned in the 3 arts, namely magic, witchcraft, and sorcery. Tegid and Ceridwen had a son, and he was very unpleasant in form and face and behaviour, and he was called Morfran. Ultimately, because he was so dark, he was named Avagddu, or Avagddu, utter darkness. And because of his ugliness, his mother was full of sorrow. It was clear that her son would never have a place amongst the nobility unless he had other virtues beyond his appearance. And so as to bring this about, she meditated upon her arts to see how she could fill him with the spirit of prophecy and make him a great storyteller about the world to come. And after labouring long at her arts, she saw how this type of knowledge could be achieved through the virtues of the earth's plants and human effort. That was to gather a large variety of plants at certain days and hours and put them all in a large cauldron of water, then put the cauldron on a fire, keeping it at a constant heat, and boil it day and night for a year and a day, after which time 3 drops of the essence of the many plants would be ready. They would cause whatever person these 3 drops fell upon to be supremely knowledgeable in many arts and possess the spirit of prophecy. The remaining liquid would be the strongest poison in the world and break the cauldron to pieces and release the poison upon the earth. And truly this story is irrational and against faith in sanctity. But the story reveals she gathered a great many of the earth's plants, and these she put in a cauldron of water that she put on the fire. And she took an old blind man to stir the cauldron and boil it. To the boy who guided the blind man, Gwion Bach, Ceridwen gave the task of keeping the fire below the cauldron, and in this way each one performed his task as well as the other, keeping the fire and boiling the cauldron and stirring it, and Ceridwen keeping it full of water and plants until the end of 1 year and a day. Then Ceridwen took Morfran, her son, and put him close to the boiling potion, ready to receive the drops when the hour came for them to leap out of the cauldron. Then Ceridwen set her backside down to rest, and she happened to fall asleep at the very moment the 3 virtuous drops leapt out of the cauldron. These fell on Gwion Bach, who had shoved Morfran out of the way, and with that the cauldron cried out and broke with the strength of the poison. And with that Ceridwen awoke from her sleep like a madwoman. Gwion, who was replete with knowledge, saw clearly that her wrath was such that she would kill him in an instant, and that she knew he had stolen the virtuous drops. For this reason he took to his feet and fled. The instant Ceridwen's wrath subsided, she asked her son what had happened, who told her the entire story of how Gwion had shoved him out of the way. So she dashed out of her house and after Gwion Bach, and as the story shows, she saw him escaping quickly in the form of a hare. Because of this, she transformed herself into a black greyhound bitch and chased him back and forth. And in the end, After long pursuit in many forms, she was so intent on him, she made him flee into a barn where there was a gigantic pile of winnowed wheat, and he transformed himself into one grain. What did Ceridwen do? But transform herself into a short-tailed black hen and swallowed Gwion into her womb, where she bore him for 9 months, about which time she gave birth to him. But when she looked upon him, newly born, she couldn't in her heart do him harm by her own hand, nor allow any other to harm him in her sight. And in the end, she put him in a coracle or skin bag and made it snug. In this she put the child, and as some of the books show, she cast him in the lake, yet others say into a river he was thrown, and others say she threw him into the sea, in the place he was found some time later. And when the time came, returned, as the following tale here shows. The story of finding Taliesin. When Maelgwn Gwynedd was holding court in the castle of Deganwy, the saintly man called Cubby was living in the land of Morn. And also at this time, a wealthy squire lived beside Deganwy fort, who, as the story shows, was called Gwyddno Garanhir. He had a fish weir on the shore of the Conwy, close to the sea, in which 10 pounds worth of salmon was to be had every Nos Galan Gaeaf, every winter eve night or All Hallows Eve. Gwyddno had a son called Elfyn, who was in service at the court of King Maelgwn. And the writing shows that Elfyn was a generous nobleman, loved amongst his companions. But he was a lavish and prodigal son, as were most of the courtiers. While things were good for Gwyddno, Elfyn had no need of money to spend with his companions. And as Gwyddno's riches lessened, he stopped giving his son money, who complained to his companions that he could not fund their socializing and companionship as he had done before, because his father had fallen into poverty. Nevertheless, as before, he requested some courtiers ask his father for the fish from the weir as a gift for him after the next Nos Galan Gaeaf, which is what they did, and Gwyddno allowed the request. And so when the day and the time came, Elfyn took several servants with him to wait at the weir, which he guarded before the tide and until after it ebbed. When Elfyn and his people came into the fish weir, they saw neither head nor tail of a single minnow. The weir was usually overflowing on that night, but Elfyn saw nothing but shadows. So he lowered his head and began bemoaning his misfortune as he turned away, claiming that he was the unluckiest man in the entire world. But in that moment, he was determined to find something, and so returned to search for anything in the weir. And before long, he found a coracle or skin bag. Then he took his knife and cut the skin, revealing the forehead of a child. And the instant Elfyn saw the brow, he said, "Well, am Taliesin, behold, a fair brow." In other words, a shining brow. Upon those words the child answered from the coracle, "Taliesin it is." According to the opinion of the people, this was the spirit of Gwion Bach, who had been in the belly of Ceridwen, who after giving birth to him threw him in the water or in the sea, where he wandered from the time of Arthur to about the beginning of Maelgwn's, which was about 40 years. This is indeed far from reason or sense. Nevertheless, As before, I will follow the story that tells of Elphin taking the bag and putting it in a basket on the back of one of his horses, and in that place Taliesin declaimed the verses called Elphin's Reward, like this. Fair Elphin, stop your weeping. Hoping for the worst will do no good. Never was anything better had in Gwyon's weir than what was found this evening. With many other verses he sang for Elphin's enjoyment along the way home. Before long, Elphin delivered his prize to his wife, who raised him well with tenderness. This video is one chapter from the book Taliesin Origins that you can buy by following the links in the description below. It would really help support my work and this channel if you do so please do get yourself a copy. The first part of Taliesin's legend is then followed by further episodes in which the young bard grows into a formidable young man, besting the court poet of Maelgwn's court and rescuing his patron, Elphin, from misfortune. But it's this first part that contains the more significant elements of the myth, turning as it does about the central figure of Cerridwen and her role not only as a destroyer and mother, but also the keeper of the mystic cauldron of Awen. Ellie Griffith's tale, perhaps set down by him sometime around the 1540s, is the first of several versions of the folk tale to appear in the historical record. The later versions tell a similar story, but are most notably set in other parts of Wales. One early and significant version was recorded by the antiquary and collector John Jones of Gellilovdy in 1607. But in his version, the nameless babe isn't set adrift upon the River Conwy in North Wales and found in a weir close to its estuary, but is cast upon the Dyfi River in mid-Wales and found on the nearby beach of Barth, which is significant when we consider that the ancient name of the place was Porth Gwyno, the port of Gwyno, Elphin's father in the tale. When Barth Beach was recently surveyed by an archaeological team from Lampeter University, they found an ancient fish weir of oaken stakes buried under the sands. There are other geographical factors that make John Jones's version interesting, such as a beach in the estuary called Traeth Maelgwn, Maelgwn's Beach, or the fact that the source of the Dyfi River, a small mountain tarn called Creiglin Dyfi, is only a few miles from Llyntegid, Cerridwen's home in both the earliest versions. Or perhaps that the Dyfi estuary is overlooked by Bedd Taliesin, Taliesin's grave, an old burial mound that has borne the legendary bard's name for several hundred years at least. John Jones's 1607 version is also the earliest to mention the 3 animal transformations. And she ran after him, and he saw her, and transformed into a hare while running. And then she transformed into a greyhound and caused him to swerve, and turned him towards the river Eirwen. So he leaped into the river and transformed into a fish. And she, as an otter, sought him below the water, until it was unavoidable for him to do nothing but transform into a bird for the sky. And she, a hawk, pursued him, and did not give him respite in the air. The other significant difference in Jones's version is that Gwion Bach apparently receives the 3 drops by accident, not through any malice, giving a slightly different meaning to the tale. Neither does Jones record as many events after Elphin's discovery and naming of Taliesin. But both Griffith and Jones are telling the same basic story and preserving the same common myth, told far and wide by both high and low-born Welsh. And neither do both authors simply refer to the tale in passing. Griffith gives as full an account as he can, clearly drawing on external sources and searching out the verses for the different episodes of the story. It was no minor tale included as an afterthought, but an important myth that lay at the heart of the Welsh culture of his time. He couldn't tell the full story of world history without including it in all its magic and wonder. Yet neither could Griffith simply recount the tale. He also included his own critique of the stranger parts, particularly those sections he believed were irrational and against faith and sanctity. He was conscious of his responsibility to maintain certain standards. Griffith clearly saw himself as a historian assessing the veracity of his sources, and where they diverged from the cultural norms of early modern scholarship, norms heavily influenced by the Church, he was duty-bound to call out the irrational and reveal the limitations of the materials he was drawing upon. Griffith wasn't a mystic, even if his fascination with traditional prophecy could lead us to think otherwise. From within the culture of his own time, he was seeking to maintain the highest standard of scholarship, and as a result, his version is not that of folk culture or common belief, but of a compiler of history. To search out what mythological strands and folk beliefs are preserved in his version, we must turn to other comparative sources. During the last years of Griffith's work on his chronicle, the wheel of history continued to turn. Henry VIII continued to plough through wives like birthday cakes and tried a few times to regain territory in France. But even though his French schemes bore little fruit, at home he had successfully bound Wales ever tighter to England with the Acts of Union, making independence impossible to even imagine for almost half a millennium, and banning the Welsh language from the corridors of power and the courts of law. The educated Welsh, particularly those in service to the English crown, became further embedded in that establishment, drifting further from their cultural roots. Many intentionally neglected their native tongue and often kept little more than their Welsh names. This period became known as Brad yr Uchelwyr in Welsh history, the betrayal of the nobility. An acknowledgement by the monoglot folk of Common Wales that their betters had largely abandoned them to their poverty and disenfranchisement and taken more luxurious apartments in England. Yet despite the dramatic anglicising of the upper classes, the folk culture of Wales, rooted as it was in one of the oldest languages in northwestern Europe, persisted and is given voice in the historical record through the many stories, poems and legends, set down not under the patronage of the absent nobility, but by enthusiasts and lay folk like Ellie Griffith, the soldier of Calais, who, far from home, would return time and again to the words and visions of his own native culture.